The reason those policy changes don't take hold, and this is kind of the main message of my book, that was my question going out into the, it's like, if these low-cost solutions are right at hand, why aren't people doing them? You know, it's because agribusiness can't make money off them. It's just really that simple. And agribusiness drives the bus, and agribusiness writes the policies. And when I say they write the policies, they actually write the policies. I was in Malawi and was reporting on their new seed policy, which was awful. And I said to an NGO leader there, I said, this policy is so bad it could have been written by Monsanto. And he looks down at his shoes and he says, well, one of the authors was from Monsanto. I'm like, well, nobody in Malawi knew that at the time. It became big news and created a lot of pushback on that terrible seed bill.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Lindley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture, all without toxic chemicals. You just heard from Tim Wise, the author of Eating Tomorrow, Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food. If you watched our 2024 online symposium about the Green Revolution, you'll recognize Tim as deeply knowledgeable on the active ways that chemical companies and now biotech companies and philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation still use the Green Revolution strategies to manipulate governments into investing billions of dollars into farming practices that result in increased poverty and hunger, which is the whole problem they claim to solve. So here's Tim speaking on this and more at our Real Organic Conference at Churchtown Dairy in Hudson, New York this past September. Our next speaker is Tim Wise, and if anybody can overcome in the language and how we describe the myths of the Green Revolution, Tim is your man. So come on up.
Thanks. Thanks, Lindley. Thank you so much to all. It's such a wonderful opportunity to get to meet you all. I wish I could meet everyone, but I'll do my best in the day we have here. Before I dive into my presentation, I wanted to actually follow up on with a short story based on what Ben was talking about just the resilience of culture in Mexico, which includes food culture. There was a 10-year fight, a legal fight, which they won to prevent Monsanto and other companies from being allowed to cultivate GM corn in Mexico. An amazing victory, fought through the courts. The courts ended up declaring the right to maize, corn biodiversity, a right to nature guaranteed in the Constitution as part of the right to happiness. Beautiful. One of the people who was part of those lawsuits, which had to fight, I think the total ended up being something like 87 different appeals from these seed companies. So they were going to court all the time. And she's told me that every time they went to court, they would bring a plate of supermarket-bought tortillas and a plate of homemade tortillas made from native Mexican corn. And they'd place them in front of the judge and greet him with these two plates and tell him, you can taste the difference. And that was their introduction to how their lawyer actually told me, I said, why do you think you can beat the big seed companies? And he said, the judge eats tacos. He said, everybody in Mexico eats tacos. They know the difference. And so far, they've known the difference, which is a great thing. What I want to talk about here, though, is mostly another part of the world. Africa. my book, Eating Tomorrow, the subtitle is Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food. And this is the battle for the future of food. If it's going on anywhere most intensely, it's in Africa because they still have a native food culture to defend. It hasn't been industrialized to the same extent. And so there's a real solid basis, like in parts of Mexico. Now, you may have noticed that Bill Gates is making the rounds again. Have you seen? I know. He has basically a self-funded documentary on Netflix, a set of, I think it's 9 hours, is that right? 5 hours? I don't know. Too much Bill Gates. Without any acknowledgement that people he has funded have basically made it. He's at the UN General Assembly in New York, acting like an elected leader, which he's gotten everyone to do because he's a billionaire. And he's put out and is promoting another edition of his annual goalkeeper report. The goalkeeper report is his, again, self-anointed effort to track progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals the UN sets on hunger, on poverty, on sustainability. The other night, I caught him, or he caught me, I guess, on the Stephen Colbert show, answering basically puffball questions, which I'm sure his staff made Colbert agree to beforehand, because that's the way the Gates Foundation works, not going off script here. But Colbert kind of tweaked a little bit. But the goalkeeper report was really what he was trying to promote. And the focus of the goalkeeper report this year is on declining progress against child malnutrition. The progress is slowed, and Colbert asked Gates what he thinks we should do about that, because, of course, Bill has all the answers. He's the smartest guy in the room, and so what are the solutions? And I'm not kidding. The solution turns out to be chicken bouillon. Chicken bouillon for the poor in Africa, he says. They can't even afford chicken. So what they rely on to supplement their food preparations is bouillon. So what we need to do to address child malnutrition is fortify that bouillon with 15 different vitamins. That's all we need to do. Vitamin-enhanced chicken bouillon. I mean, you think about that. It's like this guy's up there talking about child malnutrition, and he's offering a solution that basically has nothing to do with food. It has nothing to do with growing more food, with growing better food, with improving diets. It has to do with, let's be real, another tech upgrade. A tech upgrade of sticking more vitamins into chicken bouillon. That's his world. But this is worse than ironic, and it had me kind of bolting out of my chair and completely changing my talk here, because Bill Gates himself is actually significantly responsible for the lack of nutritional variety and diversity in Africa. He has funded, through his pet project, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, with more than $1 billion of his own money, a project that has forced and bribed African farmers to grow more and more starchy staples like corn and less of their traditional crops. So that's what I want to talk about. Basically, that project, which started in 2006, has dumped, like I said, billions if you add the subsidies that governments provide to their farmers. They don't provide subsidies to grow more food, they provide subsidies to grow more corn. And what do you do when you throw subsidies at a crop? People start growing more of it. We've seen that here. We see that anywhere. So what the result of this huge project has been the diversion of land away from traditional staples, far healthier staples. We're talking about millet, sorghum, sweet potatoes, cassava, parts of the traditional diet. People started pulling their land out of those crops and putting it into corn. People started not being able to grow those crops because there was pressure on their land from other farmers. So Bill Gates is actually quite directly responsible for the decline in crop diversity in Africa. And that results in a decline in diet diversity, because what do these poor, smaller farmers eat? They eat what they grow. If all you're growing is corn, you're only eating corn. And they've seen diet diversity go way, way down in big parts of Africa. And that would be almost arguably tolerable if you were growing a whole lot more corn. And that's the theory, right? We're gonna subsidize it. We're gonna get you new commercial varieties that'll be high yielding, and we're gonna subsidize your fertilizer. And with all of that, you're gonna get this big jump in harvests. You're gonna sell it, and with that money, you're gonna buy diverse diets. Guess what? No yield increases to speak of, no income improvements to speak of, and worsening hunger. I did a separate study after my book was published that has kind of remarkably stayed like the numbers that people have to answer to. And it was done 4 years ago, but they have no answers to this. AGRA came in promising a doubling of yields for 30 million farmers, a doubling of incomes for 30 million farmers, and cutting food insecurity in half. So ambitious goals, I give them credit for ambitious goals. They achieved none of them and didn't even come close. The yields, even on corn, went up in, 12 years, 27%. It's a very slow yield growth for your priority crop. Of course, what happened with the yields for all the other traditional staples? They went down. Cassava, millet, land planted to those went down, and yields went down. Overall, I created something I called a staple yield index that sort of combined all of these different main crops into one package. It showed a whopping yield increase over 12 years of 18%. That is slower than it was before this grand Green Revolution project came on the scene. So a complete disaster on yields. Incomes? Well, if you're not really getting much of a surplus, you're not really selling much more. And guess what? All of those inputs cost more money than what you were doing before. You were saving your seeds, you were replanting, you had very low costs, pretty low yields, but now you have very high costs, not much higher yields. Many of those farmers ended up in debt and lost their land. So incomes, not a success story for AGRA. And reduced hunger, we're focusing on child malnutrition in his goalkeeper report and slowing progress. Well, thank you, Bill. You are partly responsible. 13 African countries are part of this Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, participate in it. In those countries, hunger didn't go down by 50%, it went up by 50%. Literally a 50% increase in the number of severely chronically hungry people. A disaster. So Bill Gates, the goalkeeper, isn't exactly keeping track of his own goals. These were his goals coming in with the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and he failed miserably on every one. African farm groups have been pressuring every year, bringing these results to the attention of African governments, development agency. USAID supports this program. You'll be sad to know, but not surprised. And people like the Gates Foundation. And they've just doubled down year after year on further tweaks to their Green Revolution paradigm that involve, guess what? The problem with the soils have now been acidified with all the monocultures of corn fed by synthetic fertilizer. And so soil fertility has gone down. So what's the solution to that? Is it to stop growing monocultures? No, it's to make them buy lime and put lime all over their land so that they can address the acidity of the soil. Sure, that land needs lime. No, farmers are not going to go out and buy yet another input they can't afford to address the soil fertility that your programs have caused. That is the paradigm that we're looking at of the Green Revolution. And in all of this, with all this, again, child malnutrition, and Bill's answer is let them eat bouillon. I mean, think about that. In Zambia, which is a country that I focus on in my book, that is arguably one of the Green Revolution's success stories if success is measured by the use of inputs. It uses one of the highest amounts of fertilizer in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa. It uses a fairly high rate of commercial hybrid seeds, corn seeds for its corn. And it is now suffering what one recent report called a collapse of its food system. Again, a very underreported story of 50% of the drought has hit the region really hard in multiple years, but this year particularly hard. And farmers have found that their farms and families are just way less resilient to that drought, to that climate shock. And again, that's not surprising. Half the corn crop has failed. Soils are acidic, less fertile from all the monocultures and fertilizer. And the farmers don't have, they were all planted up in corn. They're not growing cassava anymore. They're not growing millet. They're not growing drought-tolerant crops that could have survived the drought. That could have given them something to eat out of their fields. Gates and USAID, African Development Bank, and African governments have made no movement away from this model of agriculture. The only movement away has been that AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, took Green Revolution out of its name. I'm not kidding. We were shocked, like, okay, I guess that's a victory. Is the Green Revolution now so embarrassing? It's suddenly baggage. I mean, who thought that the Green Revolution could ever become baggage to these huge development agencies? It's baggage. So they now say, no explanation for why, and they say, we're now heretofore only to be known as AGRA, the acronym. To which I replied, so AGRA literally stands for nothing now. And they didn't like that. And they, you take the Green Revolution out of the name, they haven't taken the Green Revolution out of any of their policies or priorities. They have, however, lost a lot of funding, which is a good thing, partly because I think of the attention we've brought to the failures of the model. A lot of people here have talked about that one of the things we have on our side, which is a really sad thing to have on your side, is that the current system is failing and collapsing. And to the extent we can get people to pay attention to that, there's a motivation to do something different. And I do think we see that. But this question of alternatives, and I want to focus on the alternatives, because what I say in my book is that the tragedy of all of this doubling down on policies like the Green Revolution is that African governments only need to look out at their own small-scale farmers and farmer organizations to see that there are better alternatives. They're everywhere. I saw them everywhere where I went to research my book. In Zambia, suffering food system collapse, this remarkable organization called the Kasisi Agricultural Technology Training Association started out in the 90s as a Green Revolution promotion agency and training people up in Green Revolution technologies. Guess what? They noticed that their cohorts of farmers, that it wasn't working, that they were seeing short bursts of a yield increase, flattening yields, the need for more fertilizer every year to keep the yields going, loss of crop diversity, all the things we know go wrong. They noticed, and they said, we're going to change course. Their director went and did a bunch of training to a bunch of training programs, came back, and Cassisi is now the largest organic training institute in the country. And you can bet their farmers, intercropped with a whole variety of different food crops, aren't suffering the same as these other farmers in this drought. They're finding a way to be resilient and to feed their families. But I saw programs like this everywhere. In central Malawi, there was this beautiful project that, Malawi is all corn all the time, basically. Even the powers that be acknowledge that they're too focused on corn. But so a university program in central Malawi partnered with a farmer organization because as nutritionists, they wanted to see about increasing nutritional diversity, diet diversity by increasing crop diversity. Was that a real thing? They went into these communities, they identified a remarkable bright orange variety of maize corn that was being grown in one of the communities. They tested it. It was incredibly high in vitamin A, which is a deficiency that's really common in developing countries, but particularly in Malawi. And they said, people like this corn. It grows well in these environments. It doesn't need fertilizer. It grows well intercropped with other crops. Let's propagate this and use it as an agroecology training exercise where we reintroduce intercropping of multiple crops, use of small livestock in their manure for compost, and in the process also reintroduce food products that take advantage of that crop diversity. Massive improvements all down the line on every measure you could ever want. Bill Gates says he wants to increase yields. They were getting way higher yields than anything Gates has seen for corn, and they're getting other things out of their land too. Climate resilience, the corn crop has a hard year because of drought. The pigeon peas survive, the cassava survives. There are other things to eat coming out of that land, and the soil gets better and better. Surprise! The soil gets better and better. You're not mining it, you're feeding it. And those are, these university researchers working with them, measurable differences in carbon in the soil and organic matter and fertility, and the resulting yield improvements. There's a larger project that some of you, I'm always surprised that nobody knows about Roland Bunch. Some of you must know about Roland Bunch. Nobody knows, hardly anybody. It's kind of remarkable, right? He has this he's from the US originally. He's been out in the world doing all kinds of things for a long time, Central America and Africa. He has this great project that he's been doing kind of as an NGO, but with some starting to get some support from development agencies, from like Catholic Relief Services, from governments, that he calls green manure cover cropping. In Africa, that looks a whole lot different than you'd think it would look here, because what it basically is agroforestry and intercropping. So he's taking these maize monocultures that people have been trained to do and pushed to do and subsidized to do, and he's saying, all you guys have to do is intercrop that maize with a leguminous crop that we will help you define what is going to be the most useful to you and the most adapted to your soils. That's their one real technical piece of expertise. I think they help with planting density of the corn too. And whether there are any trees that would be beneficial to be growing on these farms. And with that project, he has seen, in a course of 5 years, tripling of maize yields with no additional inputs. The only input is their first provision of that seed for the intercrop and for the tree. After that, it's self-provisioning. There are no inputs to buy. There are no costs. And they've seen massive improvements in yields and all the measures that come with that, food security and incomes. It's now operating, and last I saw, I think he sent out a progress report in November with 5 million farmers in Africa. So this is not a little pilot project. And he says it. He said, this was a little pilot project. Now it's a giant pilot project. And where are the governments coming in and saying, we're not going to use your millions of dollars for Green Revolution crap anymore. We're going to use it for this. The reason those policy changes don't take hold, and this is kind of the main message of my book, that was my question going out into the, it's like, if these low-cost solutions are right at hand, why aren't people doing them? It's because agribusiness can't make money off them. It's just really that simple. And agribusiness drives the bus, and agribusiness writes the policies. And when I say they write the policies, they actually write the policies. I was in Malawi and was reporting on their new seed policy, which was awful. And I said to an NGO leader there, I said, this policy is so bad it could have been written by Monsanto. And he looks down at his shoes and he says, well, one of the authors was from Monsanto. I'm like, well, nobody in Malawi knew that at the time. It became big news and created a lot of pushback on that terrible seed bill. But that seed bill would have outlawed those great farmers using that bright orange vitamin A maize, corn in central Malawi, would have prevented them from selling their seeds to other communities to allow them to do the project. It would have outlawed seeds. These policies are so draconian that they tell these farmers that unless their seeds are certified, they can't call them seeds. They can only call them grain. No kidding. I had one of those farmers hold up one of his bright orange kernels of corn and say, we've been growing this for generations, and you're going to tell me that I can't call it a seed? But it's that cynical. And that's, again, the world that Bill Gates hath wrought for this kind of perspective on farming. The good news is African farm and faith leaders have completely had enough. Faith leaders last month actually sent a letter to the Gates Foundation calling for reparations for damages from the Green Revolution. If they follow through, then in the next couple weeks, they're going to send a letter with that letter to Melinda French Gates saying, oh, well, now that you're independent and so focused on women and girls, let us tell you about the reparations needed for the damage to women and girls from the Green Revolution in Africa. I mean, as I told you, I do think the tide is turning in some ways, that AGRA has lost much of its funding. The Gates really a wholly owned subsidiary of the Gates Foundation at this point. I think they're providing 90% of its funds. But it keeps pushing these policies. But with all these alternatives and with very well-organized groups like the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, which is the largest civil society organization on the continent with member groups all over, explicitly campaigning for agroecology, they have a great campaign now, My Food is African, for local foods. Let's stop buying chicken bouillon from Bill Gates and start growing our own foods. One of the things they're going to fight that I heard is the new one in the cards is Bill Gates is now really interested in animals. Guess what that means? It means trying to appropriate the genome of the village chickens that are so much more popular in Africa than the store-bought chickens, the traditional ones that we consume off of factory farms, so that they can appropriate that product for themselves. But the pushback is stronger and stronger in Africa right now, and I think they're really getting some traction on the demands for agroecology. And that really is my conclusion, is that it's very much like the Real Organic Project here. there are organizations working tirelessly, farmers working tirelessly to show there is a better way, that we have a better way. And if we also fight for policies that stop favoring agribusiness and chemical agriculture and start favoring agroecology, organic agriculture, we can see a real difference. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Our movement is growing because you're subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and a review as well so that others can find us. You can find a video version of this interview on our newly designed website, realorganicproject.org, or on our YouTube channel. And you can join us every Thursday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. See you next time.